So it is March 11th, 2015. We're at the E.B. Ball Center in Muncie, Indiana, and we are here interviewing James R. Otteson. So the first question would be, why did Adam Smith write both The Theory of Moral Sentiments and Wealth of Nations? What was his inspiration?
Well, I think the way to understand both of those books is Smith was interested to understand what really are the institutions that enable human beings to lead flourishing lives. That's really the overarching concern for his entire career. And you see that in the first book and also in the second book, and also some of the other things that still remain from what he wrote. He wanted to understand these human social institutions, but he wanted to understand it in a special way. He was very much impressed, as everybody in the Scottish Enlightenment was, with what Isaac Newton had done to unite disparate kinds of data into a single methodological and scientific method. What Smith wanted to know was, could we apply similar kinds of methodology to human social institutions, human phenomena, human behavior? And in both The Theory of Moral Sentiments and in The Wealth of Nations, you see him applying that same model.
How would you account for the Adam Smith problem?
Yes, the Adam Smith problem. So what is the problem, first of all? The alleged problem is that in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith is describing human motivation as being driven by what he calls a desire for mutual sympathy of sentiments. So you note that word sympathy. In The Wealth of Nations, however, what Smith talks about is self-interest, self-love, no mention of sympathy. So the Adam Smith problem came into existence in the 19th century, and then we've inherited it in the 20th and 21st centuries, is how do the books go together? So is it really that there are two competing systems of motivation that he's envisioning there? Does he think that human beings act one way when they're making moral judgments and they act a different way when they're engaged in marketplace transactions? And the problem was, do those two things go together? And I would say this is also, it's not just a scholarly or exegetical problem for those two books, it's also a problem in a sense for us today, because we too want to know how morality and economics go together. And if they go together, as I think they do in Smith's books, this can provide a model for us to understand it today as well.
So you'd say the Theory of Moral Sentiments is about moral communities, and the Wealth of Nations is about like marketplace exchange community.
That's a good way to put it. So in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, what Smith was trying to do, so that book is not what you might have expected from an 18th century moral philosopher where he's just telling you how to be an upright or moral person. It's not that. It's not a book of what we might call moralism. It's really an empirical study. How do human beings come to form the moral judgments they make? He noticed that as infants, we have no morality whatsoever, but as we become adults, we develop a sophisticated sense of human morality. And he wanted to figure out that process. What is the process that helps us develop that sophisticated, mature sense of morality? And it was indeed a developmental process. And he saw in The Theory of Moral Sentiments that a key part of that was the communities people grow up in. So I mentioned this desire for mutual sympathy of sentiments. He thinks all human beings have that. And what that really means is we get pleasure from seeing our own sentiments echoed in other people. Similarly, we get displeasure when we see sentiments of ours not echoed in other people. So what this does is it's like a centripetal force driving people into society, into community. We want to have more and more experiences where we actually share these mutual sympathy of sentiments. In The Wealth of Nations, by contrast, what he's talking about there is not the small communities or the local communities that help us become the morally mature people we all become, but rather far-flung exchange. So in some sense, that's really the central problem of political economy. How do you take people who are born in groups, usually fairly small groups, they develop in fairly small groups, how do you get them to be willing to enter into exchanges with people on the other side of the planet who look different, who talk different? That really became for him the central problem of political economy. But in order to have the right kinds of political and economic institutions, you have to first understand what human nature is, and that was what was driving the first book.
What's the relationship between material wealth, approval of others, and human happiness in Smith's system?
Well, those are very big questions. So in The Wealth of Nations, you don't get Smith talking very much about happiness in any deep sense. You do get him talking about that in The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Instead, in The Wealth of Nations, he's talking about our desire to better our own condition. And I think the way to understand that is that he doesn't see wealth as being an end in itself, but instead what wealth is an enabler of things that do matter. So to the question people inevitably ask, is money all that matters? Absolutely no. The answer is no. It's not just no for Smith, it's no, period. But what wealth can do is enable people to rise out of their previously poor conditions. So Smith was writing at a time in the 18th century, and he saw with his own eyes what poverty, and in fact, the historical norms of human poverty look like. So he writes right at the beginning of The Wealth of Nations about Highlanders who, for want of enough food to feed their children, sometimes were faced with the agonizing decision of which of my children do I feed today. Well, that's the kind of poverty that greatly concerned him. How can we enable those sorts of people to rise out of those levels? So wealth, the production of wealth, and the institutions that allow for the production of wealth, that's what he describes in The Wealth of Nations. But I don't think he's under any illusions that that's the sum of human happiness. It's an enabler of human happiness. If you want to know what happiness is, then you have to look at the theory of moral sentiments, where he describes in great detail what he thinks human happiness is. And it's got a lot of pieces, and we don't have to go through all of them. But one of them, which is understandable given the way he describes the development of human moral sentiments, is close, loving relationships with other people. So he thinks human beings can be happy if they have these kinds of relationships with other people. The desire for mutual sympathy of sentiments is a main driver in this. It drives people to want to have communities with people, to bring them together to communicate not just moral views, but also all of those sentiments and preferences they have about everything, from music to art to literature to God. Those sorts of things are the things that enable people to lead genuinely happy lives, but that can only happen once some of their most pressing material needs are met.
So in the theory of moral sentiments, he talks about power and wealth bringing ultimately only a few trifling conveniences.
Yeah.
Could you mention what those are?
Right. Well, he's got a parable in the theory of moral sentiments, which is a very interesting parable. He talks about a poor man's son whom heaven in its anger has visited with ambition. So the poor man's son, according to his, Smith's parable, is he grew up in poor conditions. He looks at his father's little, poor, humble cottage, and then he looks at the mansions that wealthy people live in, and he says, I'd rather live in one of those than in this cottage. So according to Smith's parable, he dedicates himself to toiling hour upon hour, week, month upon week, year upon year, to generate enough wealth to enable him to live in a much bigger house. And what is that much bigger house filled with? Well, it's filled with nice furniture that he doesn't sit in. It's filled with all sorts of trinkets and gadgets and various things that are the outward symbols of wealth, but don't necessarily conduce directly to any actual utility or happiness. And at the end of the parable, Smith actually says, well, if that person asks himself, were all of the hours and years of labor I put into gaining these things, were they actually worth it? And Smith, sort of surprisingly, given the contemporary view or caricature of Smith, he says the answer to that is probably no. It's probably not actually worth it, which invites us to ask, well, what exactly is going on with this kind of life? If the kinds of political and economic institutions that he describes in The Wealth of Nations are the ones he's recommending for us to have, in which people are producing more and they're engaging in innovation and, as Schumpeter said, the creative destruction of the market, what are we actually gaining? And I think part of Smith's answer is that the process itself is the result. So for some people, dedicating your life to producing something, it doesn't have to be material goods, it could be other sorts of things, but feeling as though I'm contributing in some important, substantial way to making some people's lives better, even if only marginally, that is the key to happiness. So it's not a utilitarian calculation. In fact, Smith, I think, is very much against only thinking about your life in terms of utilitarian calculations. It's generating, so the metaphor that sometimes people say today that life is a race, that's not the Smithian view. Life's not a race, it's a journey. It's a journey for you to find out the way that you individually, I individually, we as individuals can find meaning and fulfillment in life. And given our particular psychological construction that Smith thinks we have, that will be producing things. We are actors, we are doers, we are producers. So we have to have a political arena in which we can do that, and with enough freedom and also responsibility that will allow us to figure out what the best way for us to express our true selves by making other people's lives better at the same time.
Do you think people would, if they could trade, say, wealth, like material wealth, for more personal virtue or having less personal bias in their lives, do you think they would do something like that?
Some people certainly would, I think, but I think you have to have a bit of a historical perspective about that. So if we're living in the 21st century, if we're Americans in the 21st century, we have to remember that we enjoy at our fingertips more wealth than previous generations could even conceived of. So we've passed through the thresholds of the minimum subsistence levels of human life. So once you pass certain thresholds, when we're not really worrying about, for those people who are lucky enough, not to worry about, can I eat today? Will my children eat today? Where will I live? That's when you can begin to ask yourself questions about, well, what's a virtuous human life? What could I do to lead a life well and truly lived? The production of wealth is what enables us to have that really important, but nevertheless still luxury opportunity to ask ourselves those questions. So if you say, would people be willing to trade wealth for virtue? The first question you have to ask is, well, do they have enough wealth to live above subsistence levels? Because below those levels, they just want to eat. Above those subsistence levels, then things begin to change. And I think what you see, and I think what Smith envisioned, is that in the kind of liberal society, or maybe we'd call it a classical liberal society, where individuals are allowed wide scope to articulate and construct their lives the way they would like to, in those kinds of societies, what you will see is people making all sorts of different kinds of trade-offs. So some people will indeed be willing to give up a lot more money so that they can work in a field that really calls to them, or they can find their passion doing something that doesn't require a great deal of wealth. Other people will find their calling in generating and becoming titans of industry and generating, so you'll have the Steve Jobs and the Bill Gates of the world as well. Smith's view is that we shouldn't discourage any of those people from finding the right kinds of life for them. Because in all their different ways, if we allow them to do this, they'll be making the lives of the rest of us better off too.
So you had mentioned ambition, approval, and virtue in the theory of moral sentiments and wealth of nations. Could you define those and what Adam Smith means by those three?
Yeah. So by ambition, ambition often has a negative connotation. Ambition seems to include in it the idea that I not only want to succeed so that my life is a success, but maybe also I want your life not to be as much of a success. So there's a little bit of sort of comparing myself to other people. And in the theory of moral sentiments, I think Smith is clear that that's part of human nature. We don't only look for the best life that I myself or each of us individually can lead, we're also constantly comparing ourselves to other people. Now that's not always a bad thing, because what we get is feedback from other people that can help us correct our own excesses. So if we're excessively egomaniacal, and all I think about is me, I'm the most important thing in the world, what any person like that will soon discover is that other people don't enter into your sentiments to the degree that you do, and you'll start receiving disapproval from others. Now, if Smith's right that we desire mutual sympathy of sentiments, it will sting us when we realize this. When we realize that other people are disapproving of us, even quietly. I mean, we are very good. Human beings are very good at expressing their disapproval of others, and in exquisitely subtle ways sometimes, but we're also very good at picking it up. So we know when other people are quietly disapproving of us. What that does is encourage us to think not just about ourselves, but also about our connection to other people, how we're being perceived by other people. So the word ambition often has this sort of egomaniac connotation to it. I just want to achieve and I want to put other people down. Smith's idea is that this is, for human beings, this is in a society constructed along the lines that he recommends. This is tempered by the desire we also have for social approval. So the fact that other people are always around us and are judging us, that can sound like a bad thing, but in fact for Smith this is a good thing, because this is what enables human community, genuine community, and it's also what enables the development of common systems of etiquette and morality and moral behavior.
What would you say, how do these play out in real life?
How do they play out in real life? Well, there's no single conception of virtue that everybody shares. Even if we say, well, everybody wants to be virtuous, and there are certain virtues, charity, generosity, friendship, that everybody agrees to, how exactly those things play out in any individual life is going to be dependent on all the particular circumstances of individuals' lives. That's one reason that for Smith, when he gets to the wealth of nations and he starts talking about the duties of government, the positive duties of virtue, things like what you're positively required to do for others, charity, generosity, compassion, he says those things probably shouldn't be the purview of the state, because the state is not going to be in possession of the particularities of any individual's circumstances that will tell you what you need to do in order to actually have those virtues in your life. Smith thought that what you needed to do was to make these decisions on your own. So we certainly do have calls to virtue, but they are generated and then moderated by each individual's experiences and exchanges and associations with the people in their lives.
So now kind of shifting topics, talking about social media. So if social media had been around in the 18th century, do you think Smith would have had a section on it in Theory of Moral Sentiments?
Probably. I'm not sure quite what he would have said about it. But social media in today's world, I think, is something of an interesting, not quite controlled experiment, but an empirical experiment that we might use to actually test his theory. So, you can be the judge of it yourself. So when people are engaging in social media and are connecting with one another over social media, do they seek approval of others? And when they get disapproval, so they're getting feedback from other people, when they get positive feedback, does that encourage them to do more of those sorts of things? When they get negative feedback, does that discourage them? If so, then you might expect, if Smith is right, Smith might predict that there would be norms that would develop. Not because anybody sat down and thought really hard and said, here should be the norms, but norms will spontaneously emerge. So if you think about texting, texting has developed almost its own new language. And people who don't text, older generations who don't text, often don't even understand what's going on in these texts. And younger people who are part of this language and now who are almost being raised with this new language, it comes secondhand to them. Well, there are norms, there are rules, there are certain kinds of things you can say and that you can't say. Now, where does the can and can't come from? It comes from the people who are actually doing it. So social media, I think, is taking the Smithian worldview and amplifying it to quite an enormous degree. But it sure seems, at least, as though there are certain similarities between what Smith would have predicted and what we actually see playing out.
So you had mentioned social norms. So Smith mentions or comments about the appropriateness of how much you laugh at a joke as being part of creating patterns of social order.
Right.
So how would you say Smith's insights about human behavior that he comes up with, how does he create a social system and social norms from his observation?
Yeah, the joke-telling example is one of his favorites. He recurs to it several times in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. And his idea, it's a small example, but he thinks it's a telling example. So the idea is, and we can test it in contemporary times, have you ever been out on an occasion, let's say with your friends, and you're with a group of people, one of you tells a joke, and it's sort of funny, you kind of laugh at it a little bit, but say one person in your group laughs a little too long. Have you ever had that experience? Well, everybody's had that experience. Now, what constitutes laughing too long? I don't know. Where does that come from? I don't know, but there are rules about laughing too long. Now, if that same person tells a joke later on that's also not very funny, and that same other person laughs too long again, people are going to start drawing conclusions. What's going on here? There's something strange going on. That's an interesting example, and we can use the joking example. So there are rules about how long you should laugh, what kinds of jokes you should laugh at and you shouldn't. And there are also rules about what kinds of jokes you could tell. You can imagine, we don't have to say any of them now, but there are plenty of jokes that would be inappropriate to tell in some circumstances that might be appropriate to tell in other circumstances. So what's interesting to Smith about all this is not just that there are these rules, but where they come from and who enforces them. And the answer to both of those questions is us. They come from us. They come from joke tellers. They come from joke hearers, the people who laugh and who don't laugh. In the thousands and thousands of iterations of this in any individual's lifetime, you develop a sense of the rules about these sorts of things. So we develop a sense of what are appropriate and inappropriate jokes to tell. Now, often comedians, their stock and trade will be to push these boundaries and test these sorts of things. Can I get people to laugh at jokes that maybe they weren't willing to laugh at a few years ago, or that might be funny a few years from now or something? So there's entrepreneurship that goes on in this as well. Smith sees that as a microcosm of the development of moral sentiments generally. So it applies to everything like rules of etiquette. What's appropriate attire to wear? How should you address a person who's older than you or younger than you? How long should you hold the door open for somebody when they're coming into the same building after you? Now, if you don't think very much about these things, you'll just have a kind of innate sense about it, what the right rules are. But what Smith sees in these interactions that are daily and across all human beings interacting with other human beings is the development of patterns that can evolve into something like rules. Some of those rules will become so crucial for the success of a human society that they can be, as Smith says, regarded as the rules of God. Others of them, like what to wear, what's appropriate attire to wear, or what joke to tell, are less important, less crucial to the success of a society. So we see much more variation. But all of this is part of the evolutionary and almost proto-Darwinian conception of human society, human condition, and also human sentiments, including moral sentiments that Smith sees.
So kind of going back to social media, then, do you think that the impartial spectator of Smith's would play a role into that, or how do you think he would relate this?
Yeah, the impartial spectator is an interesting phenomenon in Smith. So he says that in a morally mature person, the way that person knows whether what you're considering doing is a good thing or a bad thing is you can ask yourself, what would a disinterested observer who knew all the circumstances think of my proposed conduct? Would that person approve or disapprove? And this can give you some guidance. Sometimes that phrase, impartial spectator, has been taken to be a proxy for something else, maybe like God, for example. I think on Smith's view, that's possible that that could be the voice of God, but in practice, what it is for Smith is the accumulation, the inductive generalizations that each of us has individually made over all of the experiences we've had during our lifetime. We have this innate sense, we might call it a conscience now. We have an innate sense that's developed about what kinds of things are acceptable and what kinds of things aren't acceptable. And we see that, I think, developing, I think anyway, in social media as well. Now, social media is a new frontier for us. And one of the key, maybe, differences between what Smith was envisioning and what social media offers is, in the theory of moral sentiment, Smith puts a lot of stock on human beings being pulled in one direction or another by actually seeing another person. So physical presence. You observe another person, you see whether, you look them in the eye and you see whether they approve or they don't, they smile or they don't. That's really what engages your moral sensibilities. In social media, oftentimes you don't have that. What you have is anonymity, or at least a kind of anonymity. And what I think a Smithian would have predicted, and this I think we also do see in social media, is that when people think that no one will know that I'm the one saying this or I'm the one doing this, when I'm the one commenting on the website, it can unleash all sorts of things that if they knew people would find out who it is, they would restrain themselves. So this, and I think we do see that in social media. So this is something of a confirmation of Smith's theory, because Smith said in the theory of moral sentiments that self-command was the central virtue. And what that means is you have to, if you want to be successful in life, you want to have good relationships, loving relationships, friendly relationships with others, you have to be able to control yourself so that you can enjoy the potential mutual sympathy of sentiments. You can't just give vent to any thought, emotion, passion that you have. You have to moderate these things. That means that society acts as a mirror, and this is a word that he used. So society is like holding up a mirror to yourself so you see the way you behave. If we remove that mirror and allow people at least the thought that they can be anonymous, which is what happens often in social media, then that can remove the incentive for controlling behavior, for controlling one's own behavior. And I think that if you look at what goes on in some of the comment sections, for example, in blogs, holy cow, you see people venting all sorts of things. And I think Smith would take that as a confirmation.
One more comment about social media. Could a person tweet or post out of fear of blameworthiness?
What do you mean by that? Explain what you mean by that.
Rather than trying to seek approval, tweeting because they don't want to be blamed.
Absolutely. The answer to that is yes. In fact, I think we see that all the time. So when some public figure is accused of some kind of wrongdoing, what's the first thing they do now? They go right to Twitter and they apologize, or they say, that's not what I meant. And I think that's part of that, yes. So we can use, and we often do use, social media for not just gaining approval, but for trying to temper disapproval that we might be receiving. And that's a very difficult thing to do. Now, one of the unpredictable things, in the sense that we don't know exactly where this will go, is whether that works. Because what social media does is it amplifies all of these natural sentiments that we have. And if people are inclined to disapprove of some behavior of yours or of somebody else's, it's not clear whether the existence of social media, which allows you to make a case for yourself, will actually temper that blame. It could inflame it and make it bigger, and I think that's unclear what exactly will happen.
And then one last comment. Could you give like the 1 minute or so response to Smith's relationship to Hume, and how either Smith, or more how Hume influenced Smith, and if there's there's a Hume influence in the theory of moral sentiments or Wealth of Nations. In general, the Enlightenment or Scottish philosophy played with this.
Well, they were two of the principles of this astonishing period of learning we now call the Scottish Enlightenment. But what characterized it, if you try to put it in a sentence, is trying to understand the world empirically by actually going out and looking. Hume was one of the first great philosophers who was trying to restrict scientific investigation to those things we could actually observe. So Hume famously said, for example, that we don't actually observe the connection, the causal connection between an event, what we call a cause, and its effect. We just see two things happening. So we see constant conjunction between things, but not the actual causal link. That subtle but important point had a big influence on Smith as well. Because what Smith wanted to do was not try to engage in metaphysical speculation to understand the essence of the world or the essence of human beings or the essence of morality, for that matter. Instead, what he wanted to do was say, let's go out and look. So the Wealth of Nations, to take that one example, is his long investigation into what are the institutions that allow human beings to generate wealth. It was not an a priori investigation. There's no metaphysical speculation in it. There's no asking about, is there natural law? Does God's will play out in natural law? Do we have natural rights? It's just, let's go out and look. We have lots of human experiments. We can look at these human experiments and we can see which ones work. That, I think, is in some sense the extrapolation of the Humean, going back then before that to the Isaac Newtonian method of, let's see what we can observe and see if we can figure out what kinds of laws would describe their regular patterns. But perceiving the deep essence of them, Smith, I think like Hume, thought that might be beyond the ken of human cognition.